All right, good morning, everybody. We're really looking forward to having a wonderful conversation this morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to IPI for our policy forum on the protection of civilians in African-led and UN-led peace operations. My name is Jenna Russo, and I'm the Director of Research here at IPI, and I also lead our Center for Peace Operations. And I have the privilege of moderating today's discussion alongside our wonderful panel of speakers. Over the last 25 years, the UN and the African Union have undertaken parallel, albeit distinct pathways to understanding and prioritizing the protection of civilians within peace operations. As a partnership between the UN and the AU, as well as the broader African peace and security architecture continues to strengthen, it's important to understand how the relationship between these conceptions of protecting civilians can meet and how they are implemented by the UN and various African-led bodies. And just as a quick side note to clarify the scope, today, when we refer to African-led peace operations, we're referring to those that are led not only by the African Union, such as those in the mission in Somalia, but also missions led by African sub-regional organizations, as well as ad hoc security initiatives, which you may hear referred to as ASIs. During our discussion today, we'll have a chance to discuss this topic and to hear from practitioners and experts, including representatives of the UN and the AU. And this event also serves to launch a new IPI report on this topic. And on your seats today, you had a two-pager that provides some of the overview of the findings, and we also have some hard copies out in the lobby, and it's posted on our website. Overall, the report makes the case that while the UN and African-led peace operations should not seek to perfectly replicate one another's approaches, they should identify comparative advantages and work toward an approach to POC that is tailored to individual contexts. I'd like to give a special thanks to the Kingdom of the Netherlands, who has supported this project as part of our broader work with them on A4P+. And before turning it over to our panelists, I'm very happy to welcome Jehoen Oostervaar, Counselor and Deputy Head of Political Affairs for the Permanent Mission of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the United Nations. Jehoen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jenna. Great to see colleagues, many friends, and to also, of course, be joined by quite a few people, I understand, online today. It is an honor and a real pleasure to address you today on behalf of the Kingdom of the Netherlands at this event dedicated to the important theme of the protection of civilians in African-led and United Nations-led peace operations. I want to emphasize right at the start that this topic resonates very deeply with our nation's core values and long-standing commitment to international peace, justice, and human rights, and we remain steadfast in our support to effective, accountable, and rights-based and community-focused engagement both at the UN and African Union peacekeeping missions. And I would like to express our gratitude to IPI, our trusted partner. I want to thank all of the organizers involved in making today's event possible and making impossible possible without having electricity, still managing to set up somehow the sound and everything, which is really, really impressive. And I would like to, of course, thank the esteemed speakers, panelists today, and everyone who gathered today, both in the room and online. Your presence really reflects a shared commitment to one of the most vital aspects of modern peace operations, and that is the focus on the protection of civilians. We're also gathered here at a pivotal moment across the world. Civilians continue to bear the heaviest burden of conflict. In Africa, as well as in other parts of the world, the complexity of modern conflicts involving state and non-state actors, political instability, and humanitarian crisis presents significant challenges to those tasked with protecting civilians. Peace operations, whether led by the UN or the African Union, are central, of course, to addressing such challenges. Over the years, we've seen both the strength and the limitations of peace operations in addressing protection challenges, but we've also seen renewed momentum, renewed hope for the UN and the African Union to work much more closely together, of course, with the landmark Resolution 2719 on the financing of African Union-led peace operations, and recently also the adoption of the resolution on Somalia and the new modalities for the African Union-led mission there. UN-led missions bring global legitimacy, strategic reach, and institutional experience. African-led operations, on the other hand, offer deep regional knowledge, political legitimacy on the local and regional level, as well as cultural sensitivity. Both approaches have demonstrated their value, but they also have shown the need for cooperation. There's certainly some gaps that need to be addressed. The challenge before us is now how to combine those respective strengths and to learn from past experiences to build more effective and responsive peace operations. The challenges faced in protection of civilians are, of course, complex and multifaceted. They required from all of us commitment, collaboration, and innovation as well. The Kingdom of the Netherlands remains steadfast in our dedication to work alongside our UN, African, and civil society partners to enhance the efficacy of peace operations. And this forum today marks a valuable opportunity to reflect on those expectations and experiences. And today we hear from several experts on the protection of civilians, peacekeeping, and peace operations. And it will, of course, be a very interesting and a rich discussion when we hear from everyone here present in the room. The aim is, as highlighted by IPI, by Jenna, is not just to exchange views, but also to identify concrete ways forward to improve coordination, to enhance the protection of civilians in future operations. The key theme of discussion today is, of course, partnerships. Effective protection requires alignment of political will, operational capacity, and strategic vision. We know, of course, from experience that there is no single actor that can address these challenges alone. Strengthening cooperation between the UN and African regional organizations is, in that respect, essential. It is essential in order to ensure that peace operations are tailored to the realities on the ground. One of the final remarks I wanted to make today is also related to what is really at the core of protection of civilians, because we must not lose sight of the communities that we aim to protect. Protection is not only about physical security, it is also about restoring trust at the local level, restoring dignity, and creating foundations for lasting peace. And at the community level, engagement is key. This means that missions need to engage with local communities, with civil society, in order to understand needs at the local level and to ensure protection efforts are informed by their realities. To conclude, I would like to emphasize that for today's discussion, we, of course, will all benefit from our honest and open exchange. Let us learn from past challenges, build on successes, and work towards practical solutions to enhance cooperation. The protection of civilians is not only a mandate, but also a pivotal necessity. Our ability to work together effectively will determine the success of peace operations and ultimately the safety and dignity of those caught in conflict. Thank you very much for your attention, and I thank everyone for your commitment and engagement on this very important topic.
Thank you so much, Shehun. And the Netherlands has indeed been a long-time supporter of peacekeeping, but also specifically the protection of civilians, so we're really grateful for that. So now we'll turn to our panel discussion. We'll hear from 3 panelists in person. We have 2 panelists online, and then after that, we'll open it up for a time of discussion and question and answers. Also, just to let you know, for our audience online, you'll also be able to submit your questions through the Q&A function on the Zoom. So be thinking of those questions as we're hearing from our panelists. So to start off our discussion, we'll have the opportunity to hear from the report's 2 authors who are here with us today, Lauren McGowan and Andrew Chi. Lauren is a policy analyst here at IPI, and Andrew is a senior researcher with the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Lauren, I'll turn to you first to provide an overview of the key findings and recommendations from the publication. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenna, and thank you again to the Kingdom of the Netherlands for your generous support for this project. It's a pleasure to be here this morning alongside my co-author, Andrew, and this distinguished panel of experts to share a bit about the key findings from our report. So first, I'll just begin with a quick overview of the purpose and the scope of the project. So our research focused on two overarching goals. The first was that we sought to identify areas of convergence and divergence in the AU and UN's conceptualizations of and operational approaches to POC. And second is that we sought to identify opportunities for the UN and AU to strengthen their partnership on POC moving forward. So while we mainly focused on looking at the UN and AU over the past 10 years, we also considered the experiences of African-led peace support operations, including the role of the RECs and ad hoc security initiatives. So today, I'd like to share just 3 findings from the report, and I would encourage you to check out the full publication for further details and other key findings and recommendations. So the first key finding is that while there are some conceptual differences between how the UN and AU understand POC, the primary differences lie in implementation at the operational level. And in part, this is because the nature of UN peacekeeping operations and African-led peace support operations are distinct. So on the one hand, you have UN peacekeeping operations, which are typically deployed after the signing of a peace agreement has been signed, and in principle are there to support the government and all parties in maintaining peace. As a result, the UN's primary focus has been on protecting civilians from external actors, both state and non-state armed groups. And to do this, the UN has come to see POC and peacekeeping as a whole of mission objective, meaning that military, police, and civilian components are prioritizing POC and proactively seeking to protect civilians. When we look at African-led peace support operations, these are typically what the UN would label to be peace enforcement missions, deployed to fight alongside a government force to neutralize an armed group and establish a protective environment. Because these operations have primarily been mandated to undertake offensive operations in highly kinetic environments, they have focused their protection efforts on mitigating harm to civilians resulting from the actions of their own forces and those of the state during operations. Now, of course, not all UN peacekeeping missions or African-led peace support operations fit neatly within these two frameworks, but the key takeaway here is that there are differences in how UN and African-led peace support operations operationally aim to achieve protection outcomes for civilians. And this brings us to the second key finding, which is that these distinct approaches bring both comparative advantages and limitations when it comes to POC. And in the paper, we categorize these comparative advantages and limitations across 5 key dimensions, and I'll briefly just go through each one now. So the first area deals with the institutionalization of POC. So here, when we look at the UN's approach, as Jenna has mentioned, to POC has developed over the past 25 years through detailed policies, guidance, training, as well as performance and accountability tools. On the AU side, the AU Peace and Security Council endorsed draft guidelines on POC in 2010, and in 2018, the AU also developed harmonized training standards on POC. In 2023, the AU released its official POC policy alongside the AU Compliance and Accountability Framework. So the key sort of takeaway here and what we conclude in the report is just that the UN and the AU are at different moments in terms of institutionalization of POC. The second area is how UN and African-led operations respond to outbreaks of violence. So in the paper, we find that African-led peace support operations tend to be able to deploy more rapidly than the UN and can more readily use force to respond to outbreaks of violence. The third area is mission composition. So here, UN peacekeeping operations have more robust civilian and police components compared to African-led operations on the whole, which have primarily drawn on their military components for protection, in part because of the nature of the environments in which they're operating in, as well as some other factors. This allows UN peacekeeping operations to undertake a stronger mix of civilian, military, and police-led protection activities, including on community engagement. The fourth area is financing and other resources. African-led peace support operations have less sustainable and flexible financing than UN peacekeeping operations, and the lack of resources does have several implications, including that it has limited the number of civilian and police personnel within AU PSOs, making it harder to dedicate the same level of capacity to undertake POC. And then the fifth and final area is the link between POC and political processes. So in peacekeeping operations are intended to support political processes, and in theory, all of the mission's work should be implemented in line with sort of a broader political strategic objectives. For the AU, in some cases, it has been able to draw on in-country liaison offices and observer missions to connect the military operations to broader political strategies. Again, though, a lack of adequate resources has really hindered the ability to fully leverage these political offices. But in short, in the paper, we conclude that UN peacekeeping and African-led peace support operations have distinct entry points for being able to link POC to political processes, which moving forward could be leveraged. And then the third key finding, which I'll run through quickly, as I know I'm running short of time already, is that there are opportunities for the AU and the UN to strengthen their partnership on POC moving forward, including through leveraging existing mechanisms. So for example, the AU and the UN have collaborated to support accountability and compliance within peace support operations. This includes efforts within specific mission settings, such as in the G5 Sahel Joint Task Force. Stakeholders that we spoke with saw these initiatives that support the AU's compliance framework as opportunities that could also help further catalyze efforts around POC and collaboration between the two organizations. We also highlight that in thinking about the future of peace operations and partnerships, both organizations also need to continue to invest in understanding the comparative advantages as well as the challenges that the other brings for POC. And in this respect, we identified the need for the AU and the UN to share lessons to help refine their own approaches and better deliver protection outcomes. So for example, the AU-led operations in Somalia, as well as the multinational joint task force against Boko Haram in the Lake Chad Basin and the G5 Sahel Joint Task Force have all developed and implemented tools designed for mitigating harm to civilians. Insights from these missions could help to inform how civilian harm mitigation efforts in UN missions with stabilization or protection mandates could potentially unfold. The UN could also, in turn, help strengthen African-led peace support operations by sharing lessons with civilian and police components on community engagement approaches, including the efforts undertaken, for example, by civil affairs or by human rights teams or by community liaison assistants. And then finally, the paper also discusses some pathways for strengthening the AU and UN partnership on protection. This includes, for example, strengthening the UN office to the African Union and establishing a joint AU-UN lessons learned mechanism to assess operations more broadly, but including a specific focus on POC. So there's plenty more in the paper, but I think I'll leave it there for now and would be happy to go into more detail during the Q&A. Again, thank you all so much for being here, and I'll pass it back to Jenna.
Thanks, Lauren. Thank you for that. So I'm going to turn right away over to Andrew, the other co-author of our report, and thank you so much for being here and coming to New York so we can see you in person. We'd love for you to expand further on some of these themes and thinking specifically about contexts where the UN and the AU might both be operating. What do they need to consider in terms of POC in these contexts? And then can you also speak about contexts where we've seen operations led by coalitions of member states, such as a G5 Sahel Joint Task Force or the MNJTF in the Lake Chad Basin? How do we see POC being approached in these types of contexts? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jenna, and thank you, IPI, for giving me the opportunity to be able to contribute to this report. On the AU and UN dynamic, I think there are 5 key things for me that are important. The first being the right type of POC approach, and this is key. It's not just about having a POC approach, but it's a POC approach that is the right one for the right context, but also understanding in essence, what is taking place on the ground and ensuring that the POC strategy addresses those issues as well. There's also a need for me, from what we find from the report, this idea of a modular approach. Now, this has obviously been used oftentimes in UN peacekeeping operations, but there could be an opportunity here to really draw on different tools at different moments three different dimensions. And here it's about leveraging one partner, maybe at one scenario over another, not necessarily over another, but over a certain situation that might require, again, UN to deploy versus the AU to deploy. So leveraging that modular approach is important. The third aspect would be on the right tool. And for me here, that's about the flexibility, being able to be flexible to the situation, the environment, but also being able to interchange the various different tools at different moments. So not just sticking to one throughout the whole continued period of the deployment, but adapting that tool for the right moment. When the needs change, then the POC approach changes. The fourth aspect really is about this joint collaborative approach. And this is about really understanding what the AU brings and what the UN brings, and when we need to draw on one or the other. And I think learning about that three different phases is also important, particularly because you might have the AU who deploys and then you transition into a UN mission. And so understanding how the two organizations transition through that is also important. And then the sort of last aspect on the UN AU is this really, I think, we've spoken about it a lot, and we see, and I'll come to some details, examples, but this community-led approach, understanding what POC means for communities. What is the POC or protection issues that they have? How do we respond to those, and how does that feed into not just the columns, but the mission strategy, but overall the mission's approach to POC and delivering on POC? And so that brings me to the next sort of question, which is really, what are some of the lessons that we see from ASIs, but also African-led peace support operations, particularly drawing on the MNTGF and the G5 Sahel, but also other missions that have taken place? One, we see there's a focus more on the protective environment. So this idea of really trying to protect, clear, create safe corridors for civilians to return, but also for humanitarian actors to be able to do and deliver on their activities. And this is important partly because of the environment that African-led peace support operations find themselves in, which is, again, not just kinetic, but also high intense, but with severe levels of violence against civilians as well. They've been able to support communities to return, integrate through their CONOPs. They take a more broader approach to human security, and here, not just the human security principles, but drawing on the needs of the communities, this idea of socio-economic protection, again, drawing on things like hunger, disease, and more broader aspects of protection, which, again, I think has been a unique aspect for these operations. As I mentioned before, this idea of humanitarian engagement, being able to engage with humanitarian actors on the ground, not just assisting, but also when humanitarian actors are unable to be able to deliver humanitarian aid, you have seen African-led peace support operations being able to jump in to that space as well. There is a collaborative approach to protection, and this is providing not just a safe passage to NGOs, but working with populations on their needs as well. There is, I mean, depending on how you see it, there could be sort of a downfall, but I think also a good thing is that African-led peace support operations are able to utilize some aspects of ad hoc policing. And so where police are not able to go into those environments and areas, what you have seen is these operations are, in essence, doing some of the policing aspects as well. And so again, creating that safe passage and that safe environment, but sustaining it through an ad hoc approach as well. And then the other aspect, which is very slightly different from the UN, has been this offensive footing. So going to the heart of where terrorists are. So in this case, the MNTGF going to where the Boko Haram terrorists are, and engaging with them and trying to target their hideouts as well. And the last two aspects, one for me is the community engagement, which is really about building positive relationships with the community. And I think what you see with all of these operations is that there's a need and a recognition to engage with communities. And so they recognize, yes, our approach might be offensive or kinetic, but we need communities on our side. And so they have collaboratively worked with communities on this. And then the last aspect is the patrol. So it's not just patrolling, and we see this in some other UN peacekeeping is, patrolling up and down the main road, but patrolling where it matters for communities. So if a community member or leaders need to go to a certain particular area for firewood, or women need protection in a particular area, then those forces will tend to do it with them in a protective environment.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andrew. And I'm hoping we can come back to some of that in the Q&A. And I'm particularly interested in knowing more about how to facilitate community-led or owned approaches in highly militarized environments, because sometimes that can be difficult. And also when you have missions that are primarily led by military who aren't normally the ones interfacing with communities, which tends to be more of a policing or civilian aspect. So I'm hoping we can come back to that. But first, I'm going to turn to Ishak, who is part of the POC team within the UN's Policy Evaluation and Training Division and the Department of Peace Operations. Ishak, thank you so much for being here with us. From your perspective, are there key lessons from the UN's experience on POC that could help inform protection approaches taken by non-UN actors? And then also in terms of partnerships, how is your team here within DPO working with the AU on POC? And are there mechanisms in place for the UN Secretariat and the AU Commission to collaborate around standards for civilian protection? Over to you.
Thank you, Jenna. Well, I will briefly first speak about the key lessons that can be learned from the United Nations experience in terms of implementing protection of civilians mandate. And then we'll also say a few words about the ongoing partnership between the UN and the African Union in the area of POC. So on the first point, POC remains the priority objective of United Nations peacekeeping. If we see today, the overwhelming majority of peacekeepers are deployed to POC-mandated missions. About 95% of peacekeepers are deployed in POC missions. So one of the key lessons is the fact that the United Nations has over 25 years of experience in implementing POC mandate. Last year, we celebrated the 25th anniversary of the first explicit mandate mission POC mandated mission in UN peacekeeping history. This 25 years experience is quite relevant to different contexts, including the African Union, largely because out of the 16 POC mandated missions over the past 25 years, 13 of them were in African continent, largely involving African troop and police contributing countries. So this experience remains relevant to the African Union and other regional actors. Second, the United Nations has like a solid policy and policy framework, protection of civilians policy and handbook on that provides guidance to field colleagues. This policy captures the 25 years experience of the United Nations into this document. The policy is well socialized among member states, troop contributing countries, and it's well integrated in the national training centers of excellence of member states. So this policy is quite relevant. And the second is the handbook captures field experience from different missions, all these 16 missions, and it provides guidance to peacekeeping personnel on how to approach different contexts. This handbook captures not only success stories from UN peacekeeping contexts, but also challenges, POC challenges, and then in some contexts failures. So this is like a very important guide to peacekeeping personnel. In this regard, I would like to note that the fact that there is like headquarters-based team that provides support and guidance, that cross-fertilize different experiences and captures good practice from the field is quite relevant in the UN context. The other thing is, as has been mentioned by colleagues already, like the presence of strong civilian component is another advantage of the UN peacekeeping. We have not only like POC advisors, but also like human rights, child protection, civil affairs, and other substantive components that contribute to the implementation of POC mandate. This provides like the platform for community engagement, for gathering and identifying early warning information and other like critical aspects that help implement protection of civilians mandate. In this regard, as also mentioned, the integrated approach to protection of civilians is another important lesson from the UN peacekeeping. POC is not the work of one component or one section only. It's like the responsibility of everyone in UN peacekeeping, whether military, police, civilian, or other components. So this is the whole integrated fashion, and it's a whole of mission responsibility. In this regard, it's not only like coordination within the mission, but also beyond the mission with the UN country team. This is also important, like a lesson that can be drawn from the United Nations experience. In UN DPO policy, there are three interesting, there are three key policy requirements that are mandatory to peacekeeping missions with protection of civilians mandate. The first thing is each POC mandated mission needs to have in-mission POC strategy. This strategy provides guidance to mission personnel and also identifies the roles and responsibilities of different mission components in the implementation of POC mandate. So this strategy is really critical in terms of implementing the POC policy. The second is the POC advisors and focal points. POC mandated missions need to have these advisors. These advisors are not responsible solely for the implementation of POC mandate. Rather, they provide support, guidance, advice to mission leadership to different mission components, and then also they coordinate POC activities within the mission. So this is a very critical element of POC mandate implementation in United Nations peacekeeping. Another is like dedicated POC coordination mechanism. So this dedicated POC coordination mechanism is relevant not only to identify threats to civilians, but it is also a platform for joint analysis of the threats to civilians, and then the prioritization of the threats, because we cannot respond to every threat. We cannot be present everywhere. We have limited resources. So prioritization is critical. So this is a forum where different mission components come together to prioritize threats and then also draw response plan for the mission leadership to take into consideration. So this coordination mechanism is relevant. So as I have mentioned, these three requirements, whenever we have these three requirements in place, in missions, they have, well, we have observed that they better implement the POC mandate in UN peacekeeping setting. So wherever we lack one or more of these requirements, we struggle in some context. So I think these are like critical experiences that we can draw from the UN peacekeeping setting. And probably the last point in this regard is the community engagement. It was also mentioned by Jahun and then Andrew and then Lauren as well. So this is really critical enabler for protection of civilians. We need to engage with communities to identify threats. What are the protection risks? What are like the different protection concerns of not only like everyone does not have the same protection concerns. So different groups, women, girls, boys, they have different protection needs. And then engaging with communities brings this critical component for POC. And then also it's an opportunity to gather like early warning information. We need to engage with communities. So in this regard, the UN has like community liaison assistants. These are like critical enablers, bridges between the community and then the mission. So in POC mandated missions like MONUSCO and then in Central African Republic, these are like found to be very critical enablers for engaging, identifying threats to civilians. Moving to the second point on the ongoing partnership between the African Union and the United Nations. Well, the United Nations Department of Peace Operations has long-standing partnership with the African Union for quite some time. And in the recent context of the African Union Accountability and Compliance Framework, the POC team has been engaging with the African Union to share experiences in the implementation of POC mandate. In this regard, in the context of this collaboration, the African Union, for example, consulted us in their development of the policy on protection of civilians. So we were involved in consulted in that process. Of course, while the African Union has the policy has unique aspects that are peculiar to the African Union, still the UNDP policy served as doctrinal basis for the African Union policy on protection of civilians. So this is also important collaboration. It's not a one-way traffic. We also learned from the African Union experience, particularly as mentioned in the context of peace enforcement operations. African Union has well-developed experience in civilian harm mitigation. In this regard, for example, the indirect fire policy that they had in Somalia informed our approach to indirect fire, whether in MONUSCO or here at headquarters level. So this has been a very good partnership that we have for a while. And recently, as mentioned, the new resolution 2719 provides us a new platform for enhanced collaboration with the African Union. In this regard, UN Department of Peace Operations Protection of Civilians team is part of the interdepartmental team that's established by the UN to enhance the operationalization of this resolution. So there are 4 work streams established under the joint AU-UN roadmap. One is on compliance and protection of civilians. As part of this work stream, we extensively engage with the African Union to deliver on the POC-specific deliverables of the roadmap. So in this regard, we have identified key strategic planning documents where POC should be mainstreamed from CONOPS, directive on the use of force, memorandum of understanding between troops and the AU, troop contributing countries and the AU, rules of engagement. There are also other operational documents that the AU apply or use in the context of Somalia or other contexts. So we have been working with the AU on a regular basis to identify those documents. Second, we have also identified gaps, capacities, and resources needed to implement the POC mandate by AUPS. So wherever there is and wherever this mandate is implemented, like in OSOM or Somalia or other contexts, these are things that we have been working together. We're also conducting a broader policy discussion on what it means to implement the POC mandate by both AU and the UN. This is a policy level discussion, ongoing discussion, because there are different contexts where POC can be applied. So hopefully, I think for the first intervention.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ishak, and hoping to come back to some of those in the Q&A time. But first, now we'll turn to our two online speakers. And first, I'm very happy to welcome Adebayo Karim. Adebayo is the coordinator for the Human Rights Compliance and Accountability Project within the African Union. Adebayo, we heard from Ishak some of the ways that the UN's experience has helped inform the AU and some of the ways that the UN has also been assisted through the AU's experience on civilian harm mitigation, for example. Can you help us to understand a little bit about how working with the UN has helped to inform the AU's approach? What lessons has the AU learned about POC? And the same, moving in the opposite direction on how some of the lessons the AU has learned could help inform future approaches by the UN. And then secondly, I'd also like to ask how your team is currently partnering with other bodies, including not only the UN, but also some of the sub-regional organizations and ad hoc arrangements to collaborate on normative standards around protecting civilians. Adebayo, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jenna. I will start with the latter question, which is the lessons that have been learned by the African Union in our engagement on POC over the last 10 years or thereabouts. I will broadly speak into three areas. The first one will be on we've learned the imperative of mainstreaming POC into strategic and operational planning process for our missions. What has happened in the past, particularly in the mission in Somalia, which we mandated, was that we did not mainstream POC into the mission planning process. Therefore, when we were mandating Somalia, for example, in Somalia in 2007, for example, we did not actually equip that mission with a POC mandate. The communique of the AUPSC at the time merely mandated the mission to discharge its mandate as per the TCC's obligations under IHL and IHRL. So that led, as a result of that, that led to some ambivalence in the mission area as to whether the mission actually had a protection of civilian mandate. So the lessons here is that what we've then learned is that in subsequent missions that we have then mandated, either at the AU level or at the regs level, we have always ensured that there is explicit protection of civilian mandates in that document. Still on the strategic planning, another thing we miss, which we've learned from, is the importance of ensuring that in the memorandum of understanding that is signed between the African Union or the mandating authority, the obligation of the TCC is explicit as far as protection of civilian is concerned. Again, what happened in Somalia was that the TPCCs, when we signed our MOU with them, even when we revised the same in 2018, we did not actually oblige them to take preventive or preemptive measures to protect civilians in their operation. And when in the mission area, we then have our CONOPS, and we invited the contingent to do so, the pushback. So we've learned that lesson, and we are now in the process of actually using Somalia again as example in the process of ensuring that protection of civilian obligations are not only explicitly stated in the MOU, but also is an annex to those memoranda of understanding. So we have some other a number of other things like we've put in place complementary policies and mechanisms that were previously not in place. For example, we didn't really have such complementary policies like remedial action policy, which complements our POC. We didn't have in place selection and screening policy before. We now have that in place 2 years ago. And mechanisms like case management system, pre-deployment training of troops and officers before they deploy into the mission area to be alive, to be aware of the obligations on POC, are now things that we didn't do before. We are now ensuring we do that before deploying. Also, in the same vein, operational or document of the missions, we have now ensured that they contain clear POC imperatives. Like example, the rules of engagement of the Artemis mission and now the also mission in Somalia, it contains clear, the rules of engagement contains clear POC statement. It's the same for directive on the use of force for the police, and the risk assessment is also obliged to consider POC before the military or the police undertake any operation, any offensive operations. It's the same. We are also ensuring that our missions now have, at the strategic level, we have the POC policy. At the mission level, we now ensure that the mission has a strategy to implement the policy. The second broad lessons we've learned over the years is the imperative of resourcing. We previously, when we were mandating our missions, we would not put specific budget center for the missions to do POC. What then happened was that when we go into such mission, it then becomes an ad hoc arrangement to look for resources. For example, in Somalia, we were there in 2007. We did not have a single protection of civilian officer until 2015 because we didn't plan for it. However, now the mission in Somalia are awesome. We have ensured that as we develop a structure, protection of civilian officer should be in that mission area. Even the mechanisms, some tools in the mission, we are budgeting for it, and that is actually provided for under paragraph 15 of the POC, ensuring that that is catered for by the African Union. Finally, on the issue, still on the first question, we learned the lessons of ensuring that we enhance the capacity of the host state authority to protect their own civilians. We always say it, perhaps very glibly, that the primary responsibility for protecting civilian lies with the host state. But in our first few years in Somalia, I would say in our first 10 years in Somalia, maybe 8 years in Somalia, we didn't put tangible measures in place to ensure that the Somali authorities were actually alive to that responsibility, either by way of training, capacity building, or such. So now, over the last few years, we have put that in place, and that is an ongoing engagement. In terms of our engagement with regs and regional mechanism, as I think it was, I don't know whether it was Lauren or Andrew who said it clearly, the continent of Africa, we've now come to the reality that the so-called ad hoc intervention are actually no longer ad hoc. They have come to stay with us, and regs and regional mechanism are actually mandating missions. So what we've done at the headquarter level is to ensure that when those once the regs are mandating their mission, we ensure that protection of civilian play is explicit in their mandate, in the language of the mandate. And not only that, we ensure that as long as we are giving them authorization to run that mission, we ensure that we see clear capacity on the mandating authority to protect civilians. For example, in our mission, in the mission we authorize the MNJTF, we ensure that we support them with compliance officers who ensure that the mission is well guided on the issue of POC. It's the same for SAMI, the mission, the SADC mission in Pemba. We supported the SADC to implement protection of civilian imperatives, and also in the mission of the SADC in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So those are the things we weren't doing before, but we now ensure that in our engagement with either the mission we mandate ourselves or the mission we authorize our regs to do, we ensure we put in place such structure. On the second leg of the question, which is the relationship with the UN, I think Ayishak has answered the question very clearly. I will just be repeating what he has said. In the context of 2719, we've been able to work exceedingly closely with Yishak, with the UN POC office, and everything that he has said are things that we will easily adopt as the historic working relationship with the UN. So allow me to stop at this moment and I would with questions on my observations. Thank you.
Thank you, Adebayo. That was really useful and interesting to hear also about the relationship between the African Union and the RECs. So we're going to get into that actually a little bit deeper now with our final speaker. And we're pleased to welcome Emma Biri-Koreng, who is Director of Research at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center. Emma, it's lovely to see you online today. Thanks for joining us. In your experience in research, what lessons do REC-led operations provide in terms of how protection efforts, including civilian harm mitigation, might be implemented in the future? And then also, because of where you sit at the Kofi Annan Center, if you can speak a little bit about what role training can play in helping to maintain or elevate standards around protection of civilians. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jenna, and good afternoon to you from the sunny side. So I think from this side, and based on what has already been discussed by previous speakers, I'll just go straight to the point, and I'll follow on from what where Mr. Karim left off, in the sense that there's a lot that's happening in the POC environment, but I think a lot of it has remained at the policy environment in the capital cities. And if you talk to a lot of the the participants in training, some of these things are very new to them. And so I think that's why we are having the challenges that we are having now, because the discussions are not going down to the level at which the peacekeepers are. And for me, I think once it gets to the mission, it's already too late, because a lot of them would already have been steeped in their own knowledge, their own thoughts of how they feel protection should be. And that's why we are having a lot of the gross human rights abuses in the mission. There's a new report that's come out, I think it was a Somali journalist, that talked about the AU mission, the recent ATMIS, and there are reports of cases of extrajudicial killings, sexual violence, excessive use of force that have fostered deep-seated resentment amongst much of the Somali population. And these are abuses, these are issues that are caused by peacekeepers, not by the factions themselves, right? So I think sometimes when we are talking about protection of civilians, we also need to look at accountability mechanisms, a lot more accountability of the peacekeepers, because that really has major consequences for the mission. The other thing that I also want to emphasize is that, at their core, most actors are aware of their protection roles and responsibilities, as well as all their IHL obligations. And most peacekeepers, both police, military, and civilians, they know the basics. And even when you're training them in the training classrooms, these issues are generally not contested. Where we have differences is in the field, where their interpretations of their roles differ. The other thing too is the fact that national level orientations also differ. So for example, you have the regional training centers of excellence where we bring in various actors together. But where I think we need to place a lot more emphasis is at the pre-deployment training. Because in the pre-deployment training, peacekeepers or potential peacekeepers are camped for much longer than when they come to training centers for a week or for 2 weeks. And even for the training centers of excellence, you don't have that much concentration of units and core teams working together. You have disparate teams coming from different missions, and then they come together to a peacekeeping center. So I think it's important that at the national level, the pre-deployment trainings include all aspects of POC curriculum. So maybe one of the recommendations moving forward would be that the UN, regional organizations like African Union and even ECOWAS need to emphasize these trainings at the pre-deployment training, be more interested in pre-deployment training at the national level. So I think I would emphasize that. Again, I think increasingly we are seeing a case where the UN, based on recent debates, the UN is moving towards more and more regional peacekeeping. And so it's important that how regional organizations understand or conceive of POC is streamlined increasingly. So you find that if you look at, for example, the protection tiers, the protection tiers of the AU is for, I'm sure Karim is here, he would tell us why that is the case, whereas the UN has 3 protection tiers. But I think that's interesting, so the AU has, in addition to the 3 that the UN has, the AU has what they call the rights-based protection. So this includes like the monitoring, reporting of IHL issues, human rights violations, violence against civilians, as well as the promotion of human rights. It's good to have this as one of the protection tiers in the sense that there's emphasis on it. But I think it shouldn't just be there, and it shouldn't just remain at the policy level. And I think back to the point that I was making, that at the AU, they have so many different things going on when it comes to protection of civilians. So they've done their revised, harmonized standards for civilian peacekeepers, foundation courses. There are all kinds of pre-deployment training standards, harmonized training standards for integrated mission planning. They've also got all kinds of training standards. And recently, I think what we are even working towards is a POC training guide that a lot of us use, right? But again, the point that I'm making is this is not trickling down to the national level. It's remaining in Addis Ababa, Abuja, and Entebbe. And these training standards need to trickle down to the national level, because the differences in these approaches are not being taught, in the classrooms. And so sometimes the problem also is that depending on the funding sources. So for example, at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center, we have trainings that are mandated by African Union. We have trainings that are mandated by the UN. We have trainings that are mandated by ECOWAS. And so depending on who the source of funding is, we train based on their own guidelines, right? So if it's the African Union that is bringing their trainees, we train them on African Union POC standards based on the guidelines that they have provided. If it's ECOWAS, we train based on that. If it's the UN, we use a UN training standard, right? Now, these people now go to the mission, and then they have to work together as one group, right? So that is where we have challenges. In our trainings, we introduce them to a certain extent to some of the differences in the approaches. But, depending on who is paying, there's a limit to how far you can go in terms of the type of training that you provide to these people. So I think I would end here for now, and then hopefully we can discuss further in the questions.
Thank you so much. And Emma, I'm actually going to come back to you for one quick question, because I think that's really interesting about the training. And I'm wondering, is it realistic, or would it be a good idea for these different organizations like the AU, the UN, and the sub-regional organizations to try to better align their training standards? Is that possible, given the fact that sometimes they're deploying different types of missions with different capabilities, but at some level, is there a way to better provide uniformity in terms of the training standards around POC so that there's more of a universal understanding of what should be done?
Absolutely. I think that's the point that I'm making, that it doesn't serve any purpose when you have so many different training standards by all kinds of actors. And there's that peacekeeper, police, military, civilian in the middle of it. And depending on the mission that they are deployed for, they now have to figure out which one they need to use, right? And so it's important that there's more of a convergence with all these principles. And then we have one document that says, well, protection is protection. And I think we did some research several years ago in the DR Congo, talked to peacekeepers. And when we're talking about protection of civilians, and we kept talking about the civilian tiers. Initially they were a bit confused. And then once we told them what goes into each of the tiers, they were like, yeah, but that's what we do all the time. Oh, you academics, you just like to confuse us, right? And so the point I'm trying to make is that protection is protection. It doesn't matter how different people understand it, but I think it's important that we have a convergence of what the tasks are, how we protect civilians, who should do what when you're confronted by a particular situation. And I think that is universal for all these actors. So I think, all these TEF issues we need to remove all these TEF issues, because at the base, that is why we are having all the failures that we are having now. Civilians are not being protected. We've been doing protection of civilians for, I don't know, almost 20 years now, but civilians are none the better for it. So it's important that we go back to the drawing board, AU, UN, the REX, as well as all these other ad hoc coalitions, and determine, okay, what are we doing to protect civilians and how can we do it better?
Yeah, thank you for that. And also I could imagine if you're a member state that actually is contributing troops through multiple organizations. So some of these countries are contributing troops to UN missions, AU missions, and sub-regional missions, and how confusing that is then to try and embed training standards at the national level if you're trying to keep straight multiple organizational approaches. So a great recommendation. We have now about 20 minutes for discussion. So the floor is open. If you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand and we'll bring a mic around. I can tell there's gonna be enthusiasm and I won't get to ask my follow-up questions. So we're gonna do one round in the room and then I'm gonna do one round of the online questions. So we'll start right here with the gentleman here. And if you wouldn't mind just briefly introducing yourself, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Jenna. I am Brigadier General Said Tijan Kanu, and I'm the Millard from the Sierra Leone Permanent Mission. First and foremost, let me thank the Permanent Mission of the Kingdom of Netherlands and then IPI for organizing this very important discussion, and also thank the panelists for their input and discussion this morning. I would just like to add my view or thoughts to the issue of POC, because much has been said about POC at the strategic level. But I think we need to do justice by speaking to the issues at the operational and tactical level. The first thing I think is very much important here when we talk about POC is the issue of freedom of movement of peacekeepers. I think when you listen to all the briefs from various peacekeeping missions, the first sort of setback they are getting is the issue of lack of freedom of movement in those missions. And certainly by military standard, when you talk about freedom of movement, is the ability to maneuver your forces. And if you cannot move, ultimately, you cannot have the freedom of action that is required to protect civilians. So ultimately, whatever we discuss in terms of policies, if that cannot be translated into action, which is the freedom of action to move from one location to another, the issue of POC will be an enduring debate. The second aspect, I'm very much impressed that one of the panelists made mention of it, which is flexibility. Flexibility is very key. If a particular approach is not working well, there is every requirement for us to switch from one modular approach to another or change the strategy, which is very much key in terms of protecting civilians, particularly so when it comes to the physical protection. Now, I will talk about the responsibility as well. I know we are very much aware that it is a shared responsibility between the peacekeeping mission and the host nation. But apparently, there's an adage in Africa which says, where everybody is responsible, no one is responsible. So basically, there was a situation we had in UNAMID in Darfur then, in 2008 and 2009. There was a particular Nigerian battalion that was dedicated for the protection of civilians, and it worked out very well in Sector South, Niala. For instance, they were conducting standing patrols, reassurance patrols, escort patrols, particularly when the women and girls become vulnerable, when they go to farms, when they go to fetch firewood, they go to fetch water, or when they attend community functions. And in some cases, they were even fighting patrols, which actually deter the insurgents from coming back after those people. Now, the other issue I want to talk about is the issue of capacity of the security sector. Now, you cannot talk about POC, in essence, at the operational level, if the police lacks the ability to investigate and prosecute cases. Equally so, if there are not enough courtrooms and trained judges to hear out those matters and pass verdicts. And lastly, the issue of the correctional services. If they lack the infrastructure, the training and services to keep inmates within the confines of the correctional center, in conjunction or in adherence to human rights, international human rights law and best practices, the issue of POC will ever be a debate that will not end within the shortest possible time. Thank you very much.
Thanks for all those points, and indeed they are really key when we're thinking about POC. There was another hand up before. I don't remember who it was. If you can, yes, right here.
So thank you all for sharing your insights. My name is Jose Garcia. We work on Word, a company trying to make hiring feel human again. My question was regarding to Mr. Andrew and the lovely woman who had shared about the importance of getting the policy communications. So this is one of those challenges that top down needs to meet bottom up. So what are we doing to cultivate the people who actually have boots on the ground to really make sure they know these things, or even they might have ideas too? Because usually the people on the ground know more than the people on the top. And that's one of the impressions I got from listening to the talks.
Thank you so much. We'll go back to our panelists briefly, but I have quite a few questions that have come in online. So I'm going to invite our panelists to just respond to the aspects of the questions that they want. Was there anyone else in the room that wanted to jump in? Yes, right here.
Hi, I know you actually made a point about this, but I wanted to sort of delve deeper into what the panel thinks the role of local-led initiatives are in this space. I know that this was mentioned before, but if you could speak a little bit more on that issue or that aspect of it, please do. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm gonna go back in the same order again this time, and I'm gonna ask the panelists to keep it maybe each to like 2 minutes and just pick the part you want to respond to so I can get to some of the other questions. Lauren, over to you first.
Thanks so much, Jenna, and thanks so much for all these questions. I think I'll pick up on the last one and I'll be very brief. But on the role of sort of local-led initiatives in this space and on POC, I think this was something that came up maybe in every single interview that Andrew and I did. We spoke with 50 people around this issue or more, and every single person really stressed this point, that if we're going to be talking about strategies on POC, not only do they need to be informed by people on the ground, but they also need to be ensured that moving forward in implementation, that they're continuing to draw on that experience, and to the point on flexibility, continuing to adapt as protection needs change. This came up in, again, every single conversation that we had. And in the last point I'll add into that as well, is that the capacity to do this within mission. So Ishak, for example, spoke about community liaison assistance and AU support, peace support operations. There's also some actors who have a specific focus on this aspect, as Kareem mentioned as well. And I think that this is a really critical component when we think about the future of peacekeeping operations and the future of partnerships, is ensuring that there is dedicated capacity within missions to be engaging with communities, and to be ensuring that those strategies are informed by communities themselves. Thanks.
Thanks, Lauren. Andrew, I'll turn to you next, but I'm going to push that point a little bit because the UN has long talked about being people-centered in its work, including on peacekeeping. I would argue this is not something that the UN tends to do really well. It is a very state-centric organization by nature. And so in particular, when you're talking about peace enforcement operations where the mission is really there in support of the state, and reasserting the state's authority, how do you balance that with having a people-centered approach to POC, and then layered on top of that, missions that are highly militarized and may not come from a background that knows how to do community engagement really well?
Thank you very much, Jenna.
Sorry. I really gave
Very
you
loaded question. So I think what we are seeing is an adjustment. And what I mean by this is there are some missions where you see particular TCCs who have experience over various different types of missions who are bringing in these community responses or community engagement responses to doing POC. And so I don't want to use particular TCCs, but there are some, particularly in West Africa, I would argue in East Africa, where they recognize the need to do these community engagements. So, for example, not just in terms of health aspects, but it might be also the safe passage aspect that I spoke about. But recognizing that they need these communities. So they'll bring, some example, communities together to facilitate dialogues, not just in UN, but also we see this in MTGF. So I think that's what we are seeing. This connects really to Jose's question, which is how do you connect some of that policy aspect to the community-led? And I think even though at the policy level we have these discussions, I think it is the TCCs, from what I have seen, who are leading on this. And so actually recognizing that if we don't do this type of engagement, if we don't have the communities on our side, we don't have intelligence, we don't have the necessary aspects to be able to deliver effectively. So you are seeing some of those changes. And I would say even in UN missions, particularly in particular areas like in UMIS, in Apanal, in Bentu, in Abyei, in the southern sector, you are seeing these TCCs actually go above and beyond to engage with communities. And I think that's the difference that we are seeing here. And just wanted to sort of touch on the general's point. I do agree on his second point about this shared responsibility, but I also think where we are seeing that shared responsibility from on POC is particularly, again, on the military side, because they see the need to. I'm not saying that civilians are not engaged, but I am saying that in some UN missions, there has been a lack of or an inability to be able to respond on POC aspects because of the intensity of these situations or environments. So again, it is the TCCs that are doing it both in the military side, the policing side, and some of the civilian side, which again, we are overstretching. And as Emma said, rightly, we are overlapping various different policies and documents and thinking. And so some harmonization, some convergence is critical here, because if not, then we're pulling everything on the military and not, in essence, on the more multidimensional aspects of missions as well.
Thanks very much. Ishak, over to you.
Thank you. There is no any specific question addressed to me, but just to add on the point that the General raised, freedom of movement of peacekeepers, particularly for POC, this is really critical. In some missions, for example, the access denials correlate with the hotspots, mission hotspots. So if peacekeepers are not, going to have like the capacity to move freely to these areas, their capacity to protect civilians or to prevent violence is limited. So I think this is really critical and then a challenge that most of our peacekeeping missions are facing in the current environment. So,
Thank you so much. Adebayo, over to you.
Yes, like Ishak said, I don't have a specific question directed at me, but I'll be responding to what the Millard says as well in terms of freedom of movement. In a peace enforcement missions where you have entities who are extremely disdainful of all applicable protection of civilian obligations, it's actually a double-edged sword. In Somalia, for example, you could have what we refer to as means supplied route. Those are the roads that our peacekeepers used to take supplies from Mogadishu to their bases. But what happened is that those roads are actually ordinarily safe. But however, whenever the AMISOM or ATMIS missions are using it, those roads are then laid with IEDs. And when we run into those IEDs, we explode and we inadvertently kill civilians. So it then became a big question within the mission. Are we able to actually take those supply using aviation, using air means? But that would be too prohibitive in terms of cost. So we we need to continue to use this road. So we had to find some kind of resolution to balance the protection of civilians to ensure that the roads are safe and that the civilians were not unduly harmed, because those roads, as I said, they are ordinarily safe, but whenever the Al-Shabaab people get to know that we are using the road, they would then lay that road where it is, and they will kill us, and they also kill civilians. So it was a very difficult balancing act. Ultimately, we had to have an arrangement with UN Mine Actions Service, which then engage the community to ensure that we all learn how to detect IED on the road. But just to confirm and underscore the difficulties we face in the kind of missions we operate on, is extremely difficult. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Emma, over to you. And there was also a question online that I'll pose, since it was specifically towards you. If you can provide any concrete examples of some of the differences in the trainings. And then I also wanted to pick up on one of the points that you mentioned in your initial intervention, which was talking about abuses committed by peacekeepers. And of course, you know, at least from the UN perspective, SEA and POC are viewed completely differently. So violence perpetrated by peacekeepers against communities and protecting civilians from violence by armed groups are not understood as part of the same framework. I'm sure there are various reasons for that, but we can also see that that becomes a bit artificial if you're a civilian that's being attacked. And I'm curious, from your perspective, would you advocate that there's more of an alignment in terms of those frameworks when you're thinking about the violence or abuses of IHL or sexual abuse by peacekeepers and the broader understanding of the protection of civilians?
Right. And Jenna, I think, you know, sometimes when you are looking at things from a certain perspective, we understand the differences, right? But from that person on the ground whose community is totally ravaged, they see violence as violence. They see abuses as abuses, and they feel that peacekeepers are not protecting them from all kinds of abuses. So that's the perspective. So maybe it's up for us to determine whether there needs to be more of a convergence between how we understand abuses by peacekeepers and abuses by other combatants in the conflict. Because host communities see abuses as abuses. They see rights challenges, rights violations as rights violations. They are not concerned about where it's coming from per se, but for them, all they know is that they are suffering and there's a perpetrator. And there's somebody that's out there to protect them, and that person or that entity is not protecting them. And so that becomes a collective failure of the missions. I think for us in the trainings, you know, and I think it was alluded to by, I think, was it Ishak, who talked about how the African Union and REX perceive peacekeeping, the approaches to peacekeeping. And I think that's really the basic understanding, and how we try to differentiate between the various protection tiers. So for example, in your typical training, you need to let the peacekeepers or the trainees understand that this is how the African Union approaches peacekeeping. This is how the African Union approaches peace enforcement, that they do not necessarily wait for a peace agreement or a ceasefire before they enter into that host community. And obviously that comes with all kinds of challenges, you know, associated with that, you know, so we try to make those clear. But I think also for us as trainers, what we try to do is to find a fine balance, you know. So for example, even though the UN training doesn't necessarily have a rights-based tier per se, there are human rights aspects within protection of civilians, which we obviously have to tackle when you are doing POC training. You need to talk about human rights. So at the core of it, it's all the same thing. You know, I think, you know, sometimes, and maybe Mr. Karim would fight me on this. I think it's more about a tough battle that, you know, we are who we are. We need to do things or be seen to be doing things a little bit differently from how the UN does things. And even the ECOWAS is also debating its own protection of civilians policy and guidelines, right? Separate from the African Union. So where does that leave us as trainers? And as you said, you have that peacekeeper that would be deployed for an ECOWAS mission, deployed sometimes for an AU mission, and sometimes deployed for a UN mission, and then they are left confused as to how they can approach all the various mechanisms.
Thanks, Emma. So we just have a few minutes left. So actually for these last couple of questions, I'm going to allow the panel to just decide if they want to hop back in. And if you thought I gave you difficult questions, let me pose these. The first one says, given this analysis, can you reflect on what went wrong in the DRC? There's also a question on Sudan. Just to make things a little easier, how would you address the situation of Sudan from a POC perspective? This, of course, is a conversation that's been going on in policy spaces in New York and Addis for quite some time. Incredibly difficult to think about. But maybe also to add on to that, because we are talking about partnerships here, of course, MONUSCO was given a mandate by the Council last year to provide support to the SADC mission in the DRC. And of course, now conditions in DRC have changed somewhat dramatically, but I'm curious, maybe Ishak, from your perspective or others, were there any early lessons that came from that support when it comes to POC specifically? If you could reflect on that, or if anyone has any other reflections on some of these specific country cases. And again, we only have about 7 minutes left. So if people want to hop in, I'll let you raise your hand from the panel, and then we'll wrap it up after that. Ishak, I'm going to put you on the spot, though. You don't have a choice. I'm going to turn to you first.
Thank you so much. I think the question on DRC is like $1 million questions. Well, we are still trying to process what happened. I think it's too early to say what happened, because there needs to be after action review and then the proper formal mechanism to understand and then learn throughout the process. So it's, I think, going to be speculative if I say something at this stage. So it's good to wait for proper lessons learned exercise and after action review.
Yeah, but anything on a MONUSCO SADC?
Well, MONUSCO SADC, there is support. There is this resolution that provides the UN opportunity to provide support to SADC in the SAMI-DRC in the area of protection of civilians. This was in the mission just initiated engagement with the SADC before the whole crisis transpired. I think the mission, the POC advisor, and then leadership, they were providing some training to SADC forces on protection of civilians. I think it was in November. Then they were also planning more further engagement before the whole crisis transpired.
Thank you. Lauren, did you want to come back in on anything?
I can just do a brief comment on DRC, just because we briefly mention it in the report as well. And this speaks a bit to Emma's point about different interpretations and different standards and different trainings. Just to say, in a case like the Eastern DRC, where you have MONUSCO, SAMI-DRC, and then also the East African Community Regional Force, all of whom deployed with different mandates on protection, different interpretations of IHL obligations, different interpretations of what protection means in that given context. And so just to tie it to, again, sort of one of the broader themes and findings that came out of the report, that when multiple actors are operating in the same context, arguably, right, there's a greater need for clarity on expectations, on roles and responsibilities, and on how each relevant actor is interpreting their protection responsibilities given their respective mandates, capabilities, assets, et cetera. So I think I'll leave it there.
And I also want to call out our friends from Civic, who a handful of years ago, I'm not going to remember, don't worry, Josh, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but a handful of years ago published a really useful report on protection within the context of multinational coalitions. And I remember in that report that they talk a bit about the challenges of when you have multiple actors who have different interpretations of how they need to uphold their IHL and protection obligations, and who have different political incentives for being on the ground in the first place, and the complications that this can elevate. So in the context of the growing number of ad hoc security initiatives that may not be governed as clearly by a POC policy, this could come more into play. So I encourage you to go read that report as well. Andrew, did you want to come back in?
I mean, no, I agree with what Yishak and Lauren has said, and I think one thing that comes to mind is at the various different levels, we need to also recognize what these missions are designed to do. So there's one thing to converge and have synergy. The other thing is to recognize that, for example, AU-led peace support operations are short-term. They're not supposed to be there for long-term engagement, but they are one tool. And so we need also the political side. We've spoken extensively here in this meeting about the military side to a certain extent, but there is the political side, which we really need, I think, internationally, but also regionally, need to engage more on, because if not, it becomes the easiest solution and we overburden the TCCs and others on the ground with solving all these problems. And I think DRC and to an extent Sudan are classic examples of that, where we just focus purely on one side and not the whole entire multi-dimensional whole of mission approach to that. So yes, there are failures, but I think some of that is in essence because it's driven by a particular focus. And so we need to, reconcile some of that as well.
Yeah, thank you. Adebayo, any last comments from you?
Not really. I think I've made my interventions. I don't have any specific additional comments, unless you have a specific question for me.
Unless you want to solve the queries about either Sudan or DRC.
I think with regards to DRC, we were actually there in November of last year, where we had a very good engagement with MONUSCO, with the government of the DRC on how to collaborate on a number of areas, including on protection of civilians. But the way the situation in that country has escalated so rapidly, it caught a lot of us by surprise. And I think it is wise to tarry a bit and see, do a kind of after action review, after which we'll be able to make some informed observations on what happened.
Thank you so much. Emma, the last word is yours.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Just to emphasize that, when we talk about training, somebody will say that, well, we have all these training standards, and when they get to the mission, we'll be able to bring every actor together and give them the in-mission training, which I think is often the rhetoric that goes. But I think once they get to the mission, it's too late. So it's important that, once we harmonize the standards, we take them to the national level. That's where they have enough time, 2, 3, 4 weeks, for their pre-deployment trainings. Waiting for in-mission training would be too late.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to all of the speakers for being here. We really appreciate your time. Again, we encourage you to check out the report. There are some hard copies in the lobby. It's also on our website. A big thanks to the Netherlands. As always, we really appreciate your partnership. And one quick plug is that the final paper and event of our series, our current series on A4P+, will be in 2 weeks. We have a report coming out on how missions cooperate with host governments in contexts of unconstitutional changes of government or coups. 2 weeks, unless I'm off on my dates. Yes, 2 weeks. It's going to be on Thursday, the 27th, 2 weeks from today here. So be on the lookout for that. Thanks everybody for coming and have a great day.